Okay, so welcome back to my channel. We are coming to the end, and I'm almost sad that we're coming to the end. We have made it to season 1, episode 7, the bucket list of Netflix series Ratched. There's only 8 episodes this season, so I can imagine that these last 2 episodes are going to be action-packed. But before we move forward with my recap of episode 7, I'm just going to do a quick recap of episode 6, Got No Strings. So, Miss Briggs went through surgery for the gunshot wound she sustained during Tolson and Dolly's escape. And that was the fastest recovery you can imagine. So it seemed like it was only like a couple of days before she was up and moving around, and they were going out on dates, okay? And so, Nurse Ratched's past was revealed, ironically, through a puppet show that her and Briggs attended. And eventually she ends up telling Briggs the truth about who she is and about who Tolson is and how they are connected, much to Miss Briggs' horror. Edmund and Dolly, the cops finally catch up with them. Edmund was going to take responsibility for everything, but Dolly, everything has to be overly dramatic because everything is a fantasy. She was all about, how things work in the movies. It's like she just refused to see things for what they were. So she barges out as he's giving himself up. She takes the shotgun. She shoots 2 cops, and she is shot dead. Edmund is then taken into custody, and he is returned to Lucia. Much to Nurse Ratched's dismay, you could visibly see that she is angry because that was not part of their plan. It appears it was basically a plan that he and Dolly had concocted, and so all of the work that she had done to get them to this point, he basically was just tossed away only so he could have like a day and a half of freedom, right? So after that, Hanover, the governor was so upset in his meeting with Hanover, he was basically forced to sign the release, giving the state permission to try Edmund and basically give him the death penalty. And Mrs. Briggs, in her attempt to try to stave off this execution, the trial, in Governor, in his haste, he had decided to fire Briggs. So that's how basically episode 6 ended. If you're interested in hearing my recap for episode 7, the bucket list, stay tuned. So the episode opens with Dr. Hanover, aka Dr. Manuel, in divorce court. His wife has taken him to court to seek a divorce because he is absent all the time. He's neglecting her. He's neglecting their daughter. She's telling the judge that she had to bring her mother over from the Philippines because he was just never there. And he's arguing, he wants her to, reconsider because the reason he's been so absent is because he's been volunteering his time to Japanese individuals who were in internment camps, and he started going on about how he's helping them deal with the psychological issues of being basically in prison and being separated from their families and the trauma of the children. And basically the judge was like, well, that's kind of hypocritical because you seem to be more focused on the children of the Japanese prisoners than you are of your own child. And so he awarded her the divorce and full custody of their daughter. And so as they were leaving, he's trying to, say goodbye to his daughter. But at this point, whether you want to say it's right or wrong, you can just tell that she was just pretty much fed up. And so her and her mom, her mom is there, and she's like, I guess she's cussing them out in there. And what is it? Their native language. And the little girl, she's trying to pull away from her mom because she wants to hug her dad one last time, and then she eventually pulls away from her as they got to the elevator, and she gave her father a hug, and he said that he's going to provide for her, and the mom is like, it's just a little too late. And so now we're introduced to when he actually met Mrs. Osgood, which would have been a month later. And so they're sitting down, they're talking, and he's telling her how, pleasant her son is, and how he's in such good spirits. And then she has to tell him that, well, he burned the cook today, and our cook now has 3rd-degree burns on her hands, and that's why he was in such a good mood. And so you could see the concern and worry on her face, and she's like basically begging him, like, are you able to treat him? And he tells her, probably wrongly tells her, that there's treatments for mental illness are improving, by leaps and bounds. Every day they're discovering new treatments, and he basically tells her that he's not going to treat her son, that he's going to cure her son, which is where he made a huge mistake. And it was obvious. I don't know if he really believed that, but I mean, he is a man who's passionate about what he does, what he does. But that was a tall order, and I feel like that also gives you an idea of why she's so angry. It's like, not only did you not cure him, he's disfigured. Now, granted, Dr. Hanover didn't play the major role in him being disfigured, but it's difficult for her to disconnect the two. So I'm like, okay, the minute that came out of his mouth, I was like, oh Lord, why did you say that? Okay, so back at the hospital, Mildred, Nurse Ratched, is walking down the hall, and Finnegan stopped to talk with her. And, he's talking about, we haven't spoken since the dance, and, with everything that happened, I wanted to make sure that you were okay. And you can see it's just, Finnegan. So he has feelings for Nurse Ratched, and he basically saying that he feels like he has, a lot in his life, but except one thing, he doesn't have a sweetheart. And so he asked her out, and she said no. And initially he thought that it was because of his appearance, and she said no. And she was honest with him. She was like, she basically said that I'm coming to realize that I'm a woman that likes the company of other women. And, he was disappointed, but he did agree to keep her secret. So let's hope Finnegan don't let me down. I can't, she crazy, but let's see. We got to have one good guy in the show. At least one good guy. Well, Briggs, Miss Briggs' husband was a good guy too, but, we haven't seen him since she left him. So, come on, Finnegan, don't let me down. But, and so you got Louise. She's over at Nurse Bucket's house, and she's so proud of herself because remember they had the plan for her to go in after Nurse Ratched left for the dance, and so she went into the room and she's talking about how she went through all of her stuff and how she got Nurse Bucket now has the file on Hanover, and she's talking about this little black book, and it looks like a man's handwriting, and she found the coup de grace. For some odd reason, Mildred didn't really hide the recorder. And so, she pulled out the recorder and they sat and they listened to it. But you didn't actually hear them listen to it. You heard them turn it on, but as soon as they turned it on, it flashed to Nurse Ratched returning to her room and Nurse Bucket sitting on her bed with the tape recorder. And she was telling her, oh, don't panic, it's all fine, just come in and sit down. And so she played the recording. And it was the recording of Father Andrew's version of events. And then you heard the disgusting sound of the skull crack when she did the lobotomy on him. And she, Nurse Bucket was like, I know what a lobotomy sounds like. And it sounds like you did this to protect your brother. And she eventually started crying. Nurse Ratched started crying and basically admitted what Nurse Bucket already knew, that Tolson was her brother and that she was there to try to help him out. And she's going on about how tired she is and how she's done horrible things. And surprisingly, actually, Nurse Bucket was like, I haven't gone to anyone yet, except, there is one other person that has heard this recording. And if anything should happen to me, they're going to go to the authorities. And I'm thinking to myself, she didn't say who her backup was, but I'm thinking to myself, oh Lord, your life is in the hands of the Louise, the alcoholic, and the leech whisperer. That's your backup. Oh Lord Jesus. Okay. But at this point, Nurse Ratched don't know who the second person is that has heard the recordings. And surprisingly, Nurse Bucket was in agreement that she don't think that Tolson should be killed, but he should be studied. And she goes on to tell her that, I knew something was off about you when I first met you, so I called the Office of Army Records, and it turns out that you were honest. As far as that's concerned, your records do indicate that you were a nurse, but it didn't indicate why you were discharged. And she asked her why she was discharged, and then she had to admit that she's not a nurse at all. She's never been a nurse. She's always wanted to be a nurse. And so she falsified documents to get into the Army as a nurse. And eventually, the higher up started noticing that a number of soldiers in her care started dying. And she was confronted. One of the superiors confronted her and basically said that, we have these soldiers, the set number of soldiers under your care that have died due to suffocation or something has to do with breathing, but they can't find any damage to their necks or throat. And she said, well, I provide the best care that I can. And he was like, you know what basically he wanted to have her court-martialed, but they didn't have enough evidence to prove that she had done anything wrong. And so basically he told her to get her ass off the island and basically out of his military, out of his army. And so she was resentful now because now she's wearing a different uniform. She's a waitress, and she felt like she served the same as them, and she's now having to feel like she's feeling like she has lowered herself to become a waitress. And so while she's in this diner, this soldier comes banging on the window and then on the radio to find out that the war is over. So now she's like, okay, so what am I going to do next? And then you see her typing up the letter that she passed off as a letter from Dr. Hanover. But of course, Nurse Bucket already knew that was not a letter from Dr. Hanover because Nor Hanover wrote that letter. And so she said that he hired her. He never did any background checks, and basically that's how she was how she got hired. And Nurse Bucket was like, I really do feel sorry for everything that you've been through. She said that she was telling her, like, the difference between you and I is that, over the years, I've had a number of patients beg me to kill them. But the difference is I didn't do that. And she said, and that's because I'm strong and you're weak. Why? She just can't miss an opportunity. And of course, Nurse Ratched was like, maybe you're right. And so she said, but I can't be all mad at you because we've all done stupid things behind some stupid man. You with your brother, me with Dr. Hanover. And she said, and I didn't forget your kindness that night at the party, which was a foreign concept to me, you being kind to me. And then she says, I have plans for you, me, and the hospital, but I'm going to need you to vouch for me. And so I was like, okay, so what, are you going to team up now? Is Nurse Ratched all on board, or is she just waiting for an opportunity to bump Nurse Bucket off? Or is Nurse Bucket, planning? She's anticipating that Nurse Ratched is going to actually try to knock her off, and so she's going to do some preemptive. So their first order of business is to have a sit down with one of the donors to the hospital. And the woman goes on to tell them about how, that they always believed in that hospital, and how her sister, it sounds like she has schizophrenia or something. Once she was saying, like, once she started going through puberty or something, that's when, all of these, her issues started to manifest, and how she would have these outbursts, and how they end up locking her into a cage in the house. And eventually she got out, and she jumped out of a window and broke her neck. And so, a very sad story about how her sister died. And so Nurse Bucket proceeded to pull out her list, basically saying that the governor has decided that they're going to pull their funding, and that the foundation that the donor, her family, has or oversee or something, they're going to now be responsible for funding 100% of the hospital. And she goes on to say that basically she was less eloquent than Nurse Ratched, but she was like, Dr. Hanover basically is not who he said he is. He's a dope fiend. And then the woman is kind of looking like, what? And so Nurse Ratched said he is a drug addict. And that's when Nurse Ratched started going into the story about who Dr. Hanover is, how he's actually Dr. Manuel Benyaga. And Nurse Bucket is sitting there confused. She's like, okay, but that's not on the list. And so she's looking at this. I guess they, she wrote out the points that they wanted to make when they sat down with the donor. And I guess Nurse Ratched is going off script, and so it has Nurse Bucket confused. And she's like, well, she doesn't even know any of this information, which I find interesting because I'm like, okay, you had the file. Did you not read the file, or did you guys just stop at the recording? So that's what it seems like happened. They didn't actually read the file, what was in the file. And Nurse Ratched is going on about Dr. Benyaga's past, about how he chopped off, how he was hired by Osgood to treat her son, and he ended up chopping off his arms. And you can see Nurse Bucket sitting there getting physically ill. She's like, what? And she's still going on, that's not on the list. And Nurse Ratched is basically saying shut up without actually saying the words. So she just basically brushes her off, and she continues talking to the donor. And she said he ends up sewing on the arms of another person. The child, the patient ends up getting septic and losing both his arms and legs. And you can see the horrified look on the donor's face. And she was like, okay, well, what do we do for now? Like, because she, at this point, they're all in agreement that Dr. Benyaga, aka Dr. Hanover, has to be removed. And she's like, well, who's going to run the place in the interim until we find a permanent solution? And so Nurse Ratched recommended Nurse Bucket. And of course, Nurse Bucket is sitting there with this, who, me? Oh, you shouldn't have look on her face, right? So they leave, they get in the car, and Nurse Bucket was like, well, I owe you one. And so Nurse Ratched was like, do you mean that? And Nurse Bucket is like, well, sure. And so of course Nurse Ratched was like, well, I want you to make Finnegan head nurse. And and Nurse Bucket is like, well, why would I do that? He has no qualifications. And Nurse Ratched said, well, neither do I, remember? And so of course Nurse Bucket is like, what are you up to? And Nurse Ratched is like, well, nothing. It's the right thing to do. He loves that hospital. He's going to be, he's going to be great, great at, in that position. So we flash to Nurse Bucket walking into Dr. Hanover's office, and he's telling, kind of like dismissive, like, I really don't feel like talking right now. I'd rather be alone. And so she sashays up to his desk with this piece of paper in her hand, and she slides it on across the desk. And he's like, well, what is this? And she's like, Dr. Hanover, you're being removed. And so you can see the shocked look on his face, saying that, telling him that she is aware of his past and how the authorities have been alerted, and that they're on their way, and that he should probably leave, like, right now. And so as he jumps up to grab his coat, she stops him and tells him how, she always, how she loved him, how she was in love with him, how she believed in him, how she believed in, his mission. And, she doesn't, think that he is a bad man, but, it's just, she has to let him go. And then he says, well, why are you doing this to me? And he, she basically just tells him that, it's the right thing to do. And so he's like speed power walking down the hall, and then he goes to Charlotte Wells' room. This is the woman with the multiple personalities. He just barges in her room, and she's kind of looking at him. And then next he's walking out of the room with her. The security guard stops him and basically asks him what he's doing. He's basically saying that he's leaving. The security guard is like, you're not supposed to be handling any patients. You're not in charge here anymore. And Nurse next thing you know, you hear Nurse Ratched, and she says that Charlotte Wells, came in voluntarily, so she's free to leave anytime she likes. And so she turns to Charlotte and asks her, do you feel like Dr. Hanover's treatments are helping you? And she was like, well, I think he's the only one that can help me. And so Nurse Ratched steps back and she says, as head nurse, I'm giving them permission to leave. And so Dr. Hanover gets in her face and says, I regret ever letting you in this hospital. And Nurse Ratched had to remind him, she's like, I know the price on your head. And I'm still allowing you to leave. So letting me into this hospital may have been the smartest decision you've ever made. And then he turns around and grabs Charlotte and they leave the hospital. Okay, so I'm not sure if it's the same night or the next evening or next day, but Mrs. Osgood, she's back home and she receives a call from Nurse Ratched. And Nurse Ratched basically tells her that Dr. Hanover is now out of her reach and she's not going to be able to follow through with the plan. And that if Mrs. Osgood ever contacts her again or threatens her, that she's going to go to the FBI and basically tell them about her little plot. So now Mrs. Osgood is pissed at Nurse Ratched. So the next scene is Dr. Hanover pulling up to a motel. Obviously he still has Charlotte with him. He gets 2 rooms. And the next scene is them in the diner, and the waitress comes. Charlotte's talking about how she feels dizzy and woozy, and he was like, oh, it's probably the sedative that I gave you that's wearing off. You need to eat something. And so the waitress comes over to take their order, and before she walks off, the lady is like, well, your kind have to pay up front. And so he puts the money on the table, and the waitress takes the money. It was like, you don't have to be uppity about it. Okay, anywho, so he's talking to Charlotte, and Charlotte eventually asks him, okay, so what's your plan? And his plan was to basically take Charlotte, leave the country, go to Canada. He has a friend, a colleague, whoever that has a hospital there that he wants to hide out with Charlotte while he treats her. And he feels like if he's a success in treating Charlotte, that he'll be able to come out of hiding and resume his work. And this is how crazy and delusional this man is. So, I mean, obviously, when the governor said that I always thought you should be a patient here, he wasn't joking. This is like one of the most selfish mess. This is just crazy. Like, okay, Charlotte, she has a family. She has people that care about her. Like, how you think you're just going to leave the country with this woman? And then he's talking about how he's going to hide in the trunk as she crossed the border and this whole thing. I'm like, Charlotte is not stable enough to pull anything like this off, right? So, they get back to the hotel room. Charlotte is still kind of dizzy. He was like, I probably should have brought you to your room, because he did get 2 rooms. He was like, I probably should have brought you to your room so you could rest first before we went out to eat. So she falls on the bed and he gets the blanket to cover her up. Next thing you know, there's a knock at the door. He's terrified. He shakes her awake, and he now has to kind of pull her, and he puts her in the closet of all places, right? Now, if you remember back when Charlotte told her story about how she was kidnapped by these 4 white guys, and they held her in a closet, a shed or something. They locked her in, and she was there for 9 days in her own urine and feces, right? And so he's fully aware that this is part of her trauma, but in his haste and his fear, he decided, okay, I need to deal with the knock at the door. So he puts her in the closet, right? So he opens the door. It's an officer asking about the car that's parked out front. You flash to Charlotte. You can see that she's like on a knife's edge, like she's about to snap, right? It's like this poor woman has been re-traumatized over and over and over again, because she was also dancing at the dance episode. She was dancing with the security guard when Tolson walked up behind him and slit the man's throat right in front of her. So again, she's constantly being traumatized. So by the time Dr. Hanover comes to get her out of the closet, Apollo has now resurfaced, which is the masculine personality that she has. And he's going off like, I knew that you were Hitler, that you were a charlatan, da da da. He's going on and on and on. And next thing you know, Dr. Hanover's trying to get her under control. And she gets the best of Dr. Hanover. And Hanover ends up stabbed to death. Okay. So Charlotte wakes up. She's in the bathroom. She's covered in blood. And of course, she has no idea what happened. She's terrified. She comes out of the bathroom. She sees Dr. Hanover on the floor. The first person she calls Nurse Ratched to tell her what happened. Nurse Ratched comes in. She brought her a change of clothes, and she talked to her a little bit, and then she ends up taking her to a bus station. She got her a bus ticket and told her it's a bus ticket to Mexico, and she told her how to get to this. There's a hospital there that she can go to for treatment. And she, told her that she put $50 in the suitcase, and as time goes on, she'll continue to send her, money so she's able to support herself. So she asked Charlotte, Charlotte asked Nurse Ratched, like, oh, so what about Dr. Hanover? And she basically told her, don't worry about him, I'll take care of that. And so, she sees her off on the bus, and, of course, Charlotte gets on the bus, and she's still emotional. Obviously, she just realized she killed someone. And Nurse Ratched goes back to the room, and she kind of just sits there for a while and look at Dr. Hanover. He's all covered in blood, and it's just it's a really, really gory scene. So the next morning, Nurse Ratched was outside the hardware store bright and early, just as they were opening. And she went in and she purchased a saw. And even the man behind the counter kind of looked down at it and then looked up at her, and all she could say was, good morning. And the next thing you see is she's at Mrs. Osgood's home. And she came in, and of course, Miss Osgood was surprised to see her. It was like, you're the last person I expected to see. And she had a hat box in her lap. And she's just so politely slid it across the table. And by the look on Mrs. Osgood's face, she liked what she saw. And then she happily pulled out her checkbook and wrote a check out for Mildred. Okay, so the next scene is her placing the box on the bed in front of her son, and he's all excited, and he's so happy about how things finally worked out, and then this viper turned on his mother and basically said that it's your fault that this happened. I hate you. You were the one that hired him to help me, and how you don't really care about me. You keep me trapped up in this house, and I basically detest you. And she's trying to say, no, I do love you, and everything I've done is for you. And he was like, you love that monkey more than you love me. And the next thing you know, you hear a stab, and blood starts pouring out her mouth. And one of the hired hands has just stabbed her in the back with a rake. And of course, she falls dead over her son. And initially, he was all smiles, and the guy, Diego, whatever his name is all smiles. This is the guy that killed his mom. And then he just starts crying. And Diego's now sitting there confused, like, this is what you wanted, right? He didn't say that, but by his expression, he's like, okay, so what's that about? You wanted her dead, now she's dead. Why you crying about it, okay? So we go back to the hotel where Mildred is staying, and the caseworker, Lord, what was her name? Annie? I can't remember her name. The caseworker came to see her, and Nurse Ratched met her in the lobby, and they went back to her room, and the caseworker started talking to her about, she felt really guilty. She was like, I'm really sorry. I thought they were a good family. I feel like I'm to blame for this. And of course, Nurse Ratched is like, no, you were the only person that cared about us. And she was like, I still feel guilty. And then she showed Nurse Ratched the report. And after everything came out, their deaths were ruled justifiable homicide. Now, she didn't know that, because remember, when she ran, she just kept running, right? But Edmund obviously was still stayed in the system, and then he went to a facility. He couldn't stay out of trouble. And the caseworker was saying, he kind of got lost in the system, and Mildred had to admit that she did find him one time. She called all of the juvenile places, and she found him. She went out there, and she actually spoke with him, and he told her that, of course, he was surprised to see her. He was happy to see her, but surprised at the same time. And she, he was telling her that he gets out the following Wednesday at 8 o'clock. And of course, she was happy, and she was like, I'll be here, and we can finally, be together, and I'm going to take care of you. And he was like, okay. And so I guess the bell rung or whatever, to alert them that they have to go back in. And he reminded her, Wednesday at 8 o'clock. And then you flash back to the hotel room, and she said, but he lied to me. I went there, but he was already gone. He actually got out on Tuesday. But she's like, he said Wednesday. And she couldn't understand. Well, she felt like because he felt like she abandoned him in the past, that he was going to do the same to her. That's why he did the same to her. He left her this time. And so the caseworker was basically telling her that, there was nothing that you could do to help Edmund. Edmund was already broken. His mother was a nun. This is where I guess Nurse Ratched is hearing the story for the first time. His mother was a nun who was raped by a priest, and father, what's his last name? Williams or something. It was one of the 4 priests that he killed. And you can see the look on Nurse Ratched's face, like she's shocked, like, oh my God, like she had no idea. She didn't, she just didn't know. And basically the caseworker is like, you have got to move on with your life. Edmund, you can't save him. Like you can't, just some people you can't save, and you can't spend your life, you can't spend your life running behind him trying to save him. And so, Briggs, she's, back at home with her husband, and she's packing, and she's saying that she's going to move back home to Connecticut, that the governor fired her, that he's a bad man. He's not the worst, but he's still, his hands are not clean. And she feels like if she stayed there, any, politician she tries to align herself with, he's either going to threaten, or basically he's going to make it impossible for her to work in politics. And so she feels like she'll have a better opportunity moving back to Connecticut. And, her husband, it was an emotional scene, and he was like, I really did love you, and I'm going to miss you. And then he started telling her, how, she was right. He actually apologized for getting upset before, and he told her how she was right, and how he met someone. You could see like she, was getting emotional. Like she understands that, but at the same time, she, it wasn't, I don't even think it was so much that he met someone. It was that the person that she wanted, she just felt like her dreams of a happily ever after, didn't come to fruition. And then, they eventually say their goodbyes. And so he leaves the house, and Nurse Ratched is sitting outside in a car. And as he pulls off, she goes up to the door, and Briggs opens the door. And of course, she is not happy to see Mildred. And so, she's, telling her that, she won't be staying, how she's leaving, how her life is, pretty much is up in shambles, and how, now they're going back and forth about how, how you lied to me, and, the only reason you told me the truth is when that lie no longer served its purpose. And, Nurse Ratched is trying to tell her that, I know what I want now, that I'm in love with you. And Briggs, they're kind of going back and forth, and Briggs is like, you've lied, you've been lying so much that I don't even think you know what the truth is or how you really feel. And, Briggs basically tells her that, I guess Nurse Ratched was telling her how they could be together and have this life, and Briggs finally tells her, no, that's not in the cards for me. And Nurse Ratched is like, why? And she's saying that after she got stabbed and she went in to get a scan, they found a lump in her breast, and how she only has so much time. And so, it was an emotional scene, and, they kiss, and I guess we can assume that, I guess we can assume that they were intimate. They didn't show that part. So we flash back to Mrs. Osgood's son, and he's sitting out out in the garden, and he's being fed pate, and he asks the woman to turn the page, the newspaper. And that's when you saw the article of Diego, I can't remember the guy's name, who killed his mom. He's been arrested, and so for the murder, of course. And he's laughing like, oh, what a fool. Like, can you believe that he tried to tell them that I told him to kill my mom? He was like, I love my mom. I miss my mom. And so now the whole household is gathered in the living room for the reading of the will. And, you know, the guy's reading off the will, and he's saying, so 50% of her estate is going to go to the arts. Let me see if I can find that. It's go to the West Indies Art Foundation, because she was really big in art. And the other half of her estate is going to go to her pet monkey. And her son is going to go to a psychiatric facility where he's going to spend the rest of his life. And so you can see on his face that he is deeply regretting killing his mother. Not because he cared about herself, but because the only thing that kept him in this lap of luxury, being doted on and with servants and being surrounded by art and, this beautiful garden, is the fact that his mother did care about him and that she did want to take care of him. And now that's all over, and it's all his fault. And the look on his face was priceless. It was just amazing. And I'm like, good for you. Mrs. Osgood wasn't shit, but Lord knows she fixed her trifling ass son. Lord, good for her. And so the next scene is basically Mrs. Nurse Bucket giving a speech to the staff and basically, telling them how, things are looking up for the hospital and that she's going to be the head of the hospital and in the interim until they find a replacement, and how, they really want to work to build the hospital, and we work to help their patients. And then she promoted Finnegan to head nurse, and of course people were really happy about that. And of course Nurse Ratched is going to stay on, and we really just want to work towards a brighter a future for Lucia State Hospital. And so at that point, everybody dispersed to go and do whatever it is that they were going to do. And that's how this episode ends. So, goodness, I am so glad that bastard got what he deserves. The very thing that he was afraid of is the very thing that's going to happen to him. You're going to spend the rest of your life, and he looks relatively young. He looks young, so this is going to be a very long time in an institution, completely dependent on other people, because again, he has no arms or no legs. So I'm going to end this here, and I will talk to you guys later.